April 1945. The island of Okinawa had become a landscape of death. Where there were once rice fields and fishing villages, now only craters and ruins remained. The air carried the smell of gunpowder mixed with the sea breeze, and silence was interrupted only by distant explosions that still echoed across the hills. Inside the caves carved into the limestone rocks, hundreds of civilians lived in absolute darkness. Among them was Sachiko Nakamura, a 32-year-old woman who hadn't seen sunlight in 3 weeks. Her daughter Yuki, only 7 years old, clung to her mother's body, trying to find warmth in the cave's cold humidity. Around them, other families huddled together, forming silent shadows in the darkness. The battle had lasted 82 days, the longest and bloodiest of the Pacific War. More than 100,000 Japanese soldiers had died defending the island. But the civilians, those who had nothing to do with the war, paid an even higher price. Sachiko had seen her neighbors disappear, her village burn, her entire world collapse in a matter of weeks. Japanese military propaganda had prepared them for this moment. For months, soldiers told civilians that Americans were monsters, demons who would torture and kill everyone they found. They said American soldiers ate human flesh, that they would rape women and murder children without mercy. These words echoed in Sachiko's mind as she heard American voices approaching the cave entrance. Fear was a living thing inside that cavern. Mothers covered their children's mouths to prevent any sound. Old men trembled, remembering the stories they had been told. Some had received grenades from Japanese soldiers before they retreated, with instructions to kill themselves and their families if Americans came. It was considered more honorable to die than to be captured. Yuki was starving. She hadn't eaten anything substantial in 5 days. Her small body had already lost the characteristic roundness of childhood. Her eyes, once bright and curious, now seemed too large for her thin face. Sachiko felt her daughter's ribs through her torn clothes and wondered how much longer they could survive like this. The sound of boots echoed outside the cave, heavy, determined steps. American voices spoke in that strange language that sounded like thunder to Japanese ears. Sachiko pressed Yuki against her chest, feeling her own heart beat so hard it seemed about to explode. This was the moment they had feared, the moment when the monsters would arrive. A beam of light cut through the darkness. Flashlights illuminated the cave interior, revealing dozens of terrified faces. Women began to cry silently. Children hid behind their mothers. An old man started praying, his trembling voice reciting ancient words. The American soldiers entered slowly, their weapons raised. But something in their faces didn't match the descriptions Sachiko had heard. They didn't look like demons. They looked tired, dirty, human. One of them, a man with dark eyes and a thick mustache, lowered his weapon and said something in English. His tone wasn't threatening. It almost sounded gentle, but Sachiko couldn't trust it. Everything she knew, everything she had been taught, screamed that this was a trap, that compassion was impossible, that these men in olive-green uniforms were there to destroy what little remained of their lives. The darkness of the cave seemed deeper than ever, and the future more uncertain than death itself. Sergeant Bob Martinez had seen too much death in Okinawa. 23 years old, born in Texas to Mexican immigrants, he had crossed half the world to fight in a war that seemed endless. His uniform was stained with mud and blood. His hands trembled from exhaustion, but his eyes still retained something the war hadn't managed to destroy: humanity. When the flashlight beam revealed the faces inside the cave, Martinez felt his chest tighten. They weren't soldiers. They were families, starving children, terrified women, elderly people who looked more like ghosts than human beings. The smell of fear and hunger was so intense it made him nauseous. Martinez lowered his rifle completely and raised his hands, showing his palms in a universal gesture of peace. Behind him, other soldiers did the same. Private Johnson, a young man from Ohio who still carried chocolate bars his mother had sent, watched the scene with tears in his eyes. Sachiko observed every movement of the Americans. Her body was positioned between Yuki and the soldiers, ready to protect her daughter with her own life if necessary. But something didn't make sense. The monsters weren't attacking. They weren't screaming. They weren't advancing with weapons ready to kill. Martinez slowly removed his backpack. His movements were deliberate, calm, as if dealing with wounded animals. He opened the backpack and took out a can of meat, then another, then packages wrapped in brown paper. He placed everything on the cave floor and stepped back, gesturing for the civilians to approach. No one moved. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sound of children's labored breathing. Minutes passed like hours. Martinez remained there, crouched, waiting with infinite patience. It was Yuki who broke the spell. The child's hunger was stronger than fear. Her small body moved almost involuntarily toward the food. Sachiko tried to hold her, but Yuki had already slipped from her arms. The girl advanced slowly, her eyes fixed on the cans, her thin hands trembling. Martinez smiled. It was a sad smile, full of understanding. He picked up a chocolate bar, unwrapped it slowly, broke off a piece and ate it himself, showing it was safe. Then he extended the rest to Yuki. The girl stopped 2 meters away. Her eyes went from the chocolate to Martinez's face, then to her mother. Sachiko felt something break inside her. All the propaganda, all the warnings, all the fear confronted a simple reality. This man was offering food to her starving daughter. Yuki took another step, then another. Her small hand reached out and grabbed the chocolate. She brought it to her mouth and bit into it. The sweet taste exploded on her tongue, and tears began streaming down her thin face. She had forgotten food could taste like that. Martinez signaled to Johnson, who began distributing more food. Other soldiers joined in, pulling out rations, cans, dried fruits. They placed everything on the ground and backed away, giving the civilians space. Slowly, very slowly, other children began approaching. Then the mothers, then the elderly. Each person who accepted the food was one more certainty crumbling. Each bite was a question without answer. Who were these men? Why were they being kind? Sachiko finally stood up and walked toward Martinez. She looked directly into his eyes, searching for any sign of deception. But all she found was exhaustion and compassion. She took a can of meat and bowed slightly, a gesture of gratitude she never imagined making to an enemy. The darkness of the cave seemed less oppressive now, illuminated not just by flashlights, but by something neither side expected to find in the midst of war: hope. 3 days had passed since the first encounter. The cave had been transformed into a temporary shelter, but Martinez knew the civilians couldn't stay there forever. The island was still dangerous, full of unexploded bombs and the ruins of war. They needed to return to the surface, rebuild what had been destroyed. On the 4th morning, Martinez returned with his patrol and a truck loaded with tools: hammers, nails, wooden planks, canvas tarps. Through gestures and the few Japanese words he had learned from an interpreter, he tried to explain. They would help rebuild the village. Sachiko watched the scene with suspicion. Why would they do this? What did the Americans want in return? In her mind, every act of kindness had to have a hidden price. That's how the world worked. That's what the war had taught her. But Yuki had no such reservations. The girl had regained some of her energy after days of regular meals. She watched fascinated as the American soldiers began clearing rubble from what had once been the village school. Martinez noticed the child's interest and handed her a small broom, gesturing for her to help. The girl looked at her mother, seeking permission. Sachiko wanted to say no, wanted to keep her daughter away from those men, but something in Martinez's eyes disarmed her resistance. She nodded slowly. Yuki began sweeping with enthusiasm, and soon other children joined her. It was a strange scene. American soldiers and Japanese children working side by side, communicating through smiles and gestures, building something together amid the ruins. Taro Yamashiro, a 58-year-old man who had been the village leader before the war, approached Martinez. He was thin, his face marked by suffering, but his eyes still held dignity. Through gestures, he indicated a collapsed house and mimed the motion of hammering. Martinez understood immediately and handed him tools. The work began slowly, clumsily. There were misunderstandings, moments of frustration when words failed and intentions weren't clear. Private Johnson tried to explain how to secure a beam and ended up almost causing it to fall. An elderly Japanese man laughed for the first time in months, and that sound was like music in the devastated landscape. Sachiko joined the work in the afternoon. She couldn't stay in the cave while others rebuilt the village. Her hands, which once cooked and sewed, now learned to hammer nails and carry planks. Next to her, an American soldier named Cooper worked in silence, occasionally glancing at her with respect. As the sun began to set, the skeleton of a house stood where before there was only rubble. It wasn't much, but it was something. A beginning, a promise that life could return to that cursed place. Martinez sat on a rock, exhausted, watching the civilians and soldiers sharing water and the last rations of the day. Johnson approached and sat beside him. "Sarge, do you think this will work? That they'll really trust us?" Martinez looked at Yuki, who was showing a group of American soldiers how to bow properly, all of them laughing at their own clumsy attempts. "It's already working, Johnson. One nail at a time." 2 weeks had transformed the landscape. Where there was only destruction, now rudimentary structures began to emerge. Makeshift houses, a community kitchen, paths cleared of debris. But Martinez knew that physical reconstruction was only half the work. The people of Okinawa needed more than shelter. They needed a future. The convoy arrived on a Tuesday morning, 3 military trucks loaded with supplies that went beyond simple rations. Martinez had requested seeds, agricultural tools, fishing equipment, things that would allow the civilians to feed themselves, to regain their autonomy and dignity. Taro Yamashiro watched with wide eyes as soldiers unloaded sacks of rice seeds, sweet potato seedlings, vegetable seeds. His hands trembled as he touched the seeds, feeling their weight, their promise. For the first time since the battle began, he saw beyond tomorrow. He saw next season, next year, a time when children could eat without depending on foreign charity. Martinez called Taro and, through the interpreter who had arrived the previous week, explained the plan. The Americans would provide seeds and tools, but the civilians would be responsible for planting, cultivating, and distributing the harvest. It would be their land, their work, their future. Taro organized a meeting with other village leaders that same night. In the ruins of what had been the community temple, 20 men and women gathered by candlelight. The discussion was intense. Some still distrusted American generosity. Others argued they had no choice. Sachiko remained silent most of the time, listening, thinking. "Why are they doing this?" asked an elderly woman whose husband had died in the battle. "What do they want from us?" "Maybe," Sachiko finally said, her voice soft but firm. "Maybe they just want what we want. An end to death. A beginning for life." The decision was made. They would accept the help, but on their own terms. They would organize work teams, establish fair distribution rules, ensure no one would go hungry while others had plenty. It would be their community, rebuilt with American help, but guided by Okinawan values. The next morning, the first planting began. Martinez watched as Taro marked the fields, explaining to younger men how to prepare the soil, when to plant each type of seed. The old man worked with renewed energy, as if each seed planted was an act of defiance against death itself. Yuki helped her mother plant vegetables in a small plot near their new house. The girl's hands, still thin but stronger than before, pressed the seeds into dark earth. She asked if the plants would really grow, if they would really have food that didn't come from green cans. "Yes, my daughter," Sachiko replied, surprising herself with the certainty in her own voice. "They will grow, and we will eat what we planted with our own hands." Private Johnson worked alongside an elderly Japanese man, learning how to space rice seedlings correctly. The old man spoke no English, Johnson spoke no Japanese, but they communicated through gestures and occasional laughter when one of them made a mistake. As afternoon fell, Martinez walked through the fields and saw something he thought impossible 2 weeks ago. American soldiers and Japanese civilians working together, not as conquerors and conquered, but as people sharing the same basic hope. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time, it existed. The smell of coffee woke Sachiko before dawn. It was a strange aroma, bitter and intense, completely different from the tea she had known all her life. She left the small house and followed the smell to the community kitchen, where Martinez and 2 other soldiers were preparing breakfast. Martinez saw her approach and smiled. He poured dark liquid into a metal cup and offered it to her. Sachiko accepted hesitantly, bringing the cup to her nose. The strong smell made her wrinkle her nose, and the soldiers laughed good-naturedly. She took a small sip and immediately grimaced. It was horrible, bitter as medicine. But Martinez didn't seem offended. He added sugar and condensed milk to another cup and offered it again. This time, the taste was more tolerable, still strange, but not unpleasant. Sachiko drank slowly while Martinez explained, through gestures and the few Japanese words he now knew, that in America people drank this every morning. Yuki arrived shortly after, attracted by the unusual movement. Johnson was teaching Japanese children an American song, something about stars and stripes. The children repeated the words incorrectly, creating a hilarious mix of English and Japanese. Johnson laughed until tears came to his eyes, and the children laughed with him. Not understanding the joke but happy to participate. Cultural exchange became part of daily routine. American soldiers taught children to play baseball with improvised equipment. Japanese women showed soldiers how to prepare rice properly, laughing at their clumsy attempts with chopsticks. Taro taught Cooper the basics of origami, folding paper into cranes and flowers. One afternoon, Sachiko found Yuki sitting with Martinez, both drawing in the dirt with sticks. The girl was teaching him Japanese characters, correcting his pronunciation with the patience of a tiny teacher. Martinez struggled with the sounds, his Texas accent transforming Japanese words into something unrecognizable, but he persisted with determination. "Your daughter is a good teacher," Martinez told Sachiko through the interpreter. "Better than my teachers in school." Sachiko felt something warm in her chest, pride, perhaps, or maybe gratitude. Her daughter, who weeks ago trembled with fear in a cave, now laughed freely with a man who should have been her enemy. The evenings became special moments. After work, civilians and soldiers gathered around bonfires. Americans told stories of their distant homes, cities with names like New York and Chicago that sounded like myths to Okinawan ears. Japanese shared legends of dragons and spirits, ancient tales passed down through generations. Private Johnson revealed he had been a music teacher before the war. Someone found a damaged guitar in the ruins, and Johnson spent days repairing it. When he finally played, the sound was imperfect but beautiful. He played American songs, and some Japanese hummed along, creating melodies that belonged to no specific country. Sachiko began teaching basic English to village children. She learned alongside them, stumbling over words, laughing at her own mistakes. Martinez helped, correcting pronunciation gently, encouraging every small progress. One night, as Sachiko prepared dinner, she realized she was humming an American song Johnson had taught. She stopped, surprised at herself. When had the enemy's music become so familiar? When had fear transformed into something resembling friendship? She looked around. Yuki played with American and Japanese children without distinction. Taro discussed planting plans with Cooper, as if they were old partners. The community that had been broken was rebuilding itself, not as it was before, but as something new, something neither purely Japanese nor American, but human. Spring arrived in Okinawa, bringing with it the first shoots of the planted seeds. But the most remarkable transformation wasn't in the fields, it was in the people's eyes. The empty stare of despair had been replaced by something Sachiko had thought lost forever, the light of hope. Yuki had gained weight. Her cheeks, once hollow and pale, now had color. She ran through the village with other children, their laughter echoing among the reconstructed houses. The girl who had hidden in the darkness of a cave now danced in the sunlight, free from the fear that had consumed her childhood. But the healing went beyond the physical. Dr. Miller, a military doctor who visited the village twice a week, noticed profound changes in the civilians' behavior. The trembling that had marked every gesture was disappearing. Nightmares, though still present, were less frequent. People began sleeping without waking at every sound. Sachiko observed these changes in herself. For months, her body had been in constant alert, every muscle tense, every sound a potential threat. Now she could sit peacefully and watch the sunset without feeling the panic that had once paralyzed her. She could hear footsteps approaching without assuming it was death coming. One afternoon, Taro organized a community meeting. The harvest was approaching, and they needed to decide how to distribute the food. The discussion was democratic, with everyone having a voice. Martinez attended as an observer, impressed by the organization emerging from the chaos. "We survived because we helped each other," Taro said, his voice firm and clear. "American food kept us alive when we had nothing. But now what we plant with our own hands will sustain us. This is our strength. Not resistance in solitude, but solidarity in unity." The words resonated deeply with everyone present. The rigid structure that had defined Japanese society before the war was transforming into something more flexible, more human. The absolute authority that had led them to tragedy was being replaced by cooperation and mutual respect. Sachiko began writing again. Before the war, she had kept a diary, recording daily life, her daughter's small achievements, simple thoughts about the world. The war had silenced her voice, but now, with paper and pencil provided by the Americans, she resumed writing. Her words spoke of transformation, of how hatred could dissolve in the face of kindness, of how humanity could survive even the most brutal circumstances. She wrote about Martinez, about how a man who should have been her enemy had become the savior of her daughter. She wrote about her own shame for having believed the propaganda, for having taught Yuki to fear rather than hope. The children were the greatest symbol of transformation. They had no memory of a time before the war to yearn for. For them, this new reality of cooperation was natural. Yuki played with American and Japanese children, mixing words from both languages, creating her own vocabulary that belonged to no specific nation. One evening, Martinez found Sachiko sitting outside her house, watching Yuki play. He sat beside her in silence, respecting the quiet moment. "Thank you," Sachiko said in halting English, one of the first phrases she had learned. "For my daughter, for life." Martinez looked at Yuki, then at Sachiko. His eyes were moist. "No," he replied softly. "Thank you, for showing me that we're still human. That war hasn't destroyed everything." The night fell gently over Okinawa, and for the first time in many months, it brought peace instead of terror. 10 years had passed since the end of the war. Okinawa had transformed from a battlefield into a symbol of something unexpected, the possibility of peace built from the ashes of hatred. Yuki Nakamura was now 17 years old. Fluent in both Japanese and English, she had become a bridge between two cultures. She worked as an interpreter at the American base, but her role went far beyond translating words. She translated hearts, intentions, the subtle nuances that could mean the difference between understanding and conflict. The village had prospered. The fields Martinez had helped plant now produced abundant harvests. The makeshift houses had been replaced by solid structures. A new school stood where ruins once lay, and inside it, children learned both Japanese and American history, understanding that truth was more complex than any propaganda had claimed. Sachiko had become a teacher at that school. She taught not just language and mathematics, but something more important, the lesson that enemies could become friends, that humanity was stronger than hate. She often told her students about the dark days in the cave, about the terror she felt when she heard American voices, about how a chocolate bar had begun to dismantle years of indoctrination. Martinez had returned to Texas after the war, but he maintained correspondence with Sachiko and Taro. His letters spoke of his own transformation, of how Okinawa had changed his understanding of war and peace. He had become an advocate for reconciliation, speaking at schools and churches about the people he had met on a devastated island, about the humanity he had found in the midst of horror. That spring afternoon, a ceremony was being prepared in the village square. Representatives from both governments would be present to inaugurate a monument dedicated to reconciliation. The monument depicted two hands joined, one Japanese and one American, holding a seedling that grew toward the sky. Yuki had been chosen to speak at the ceremony. She had written her speech carefully, weighing each word, seeking the balance between honoring the past and celebrating the future. When her turn came, she stood before the crowd, Japanese and Americans, old and young, those who had lived through the war and those who only knew it through stories. "And I was 7 years old when I met Sergeant Bob Martinez," she began, her voice clear and confident. "I was starving, terrified, convinced that Americans were monsters, but he gave me chocolate. And in that simple gesture, he gave me something more valuable. He gave me hope. She paused, looking at the monument. This monument is not just about the end of a war. It's about the beginning of understanding. My mother taught me that true strength isn't found in solitary resistance, but in shared solidarity. The Americans who came to Okinawa could have been conquerors. Instead, they chose to be builders, and we, who could have remained bitter and resentful, chose to be grateful and open. Sachiko watched her daughter with tears in her eyes. That little girl who had trembled in the darkness of a cave was now a woman speaking about peace to the world. The legacy we leave isn't one of war, Yuki concluded. It's a legacy of reconciliation, and that legacy will continue, generation after generation, as long as we remember that before being Japanese or American, we are all simply human. The applause echoed through the square, mixing with the sound of the wind in the trees that now grew where once there was only death and destruction.